get started. So the topics for today's Part 2 Learn Over Lunch webinar, Beyond the Norm, include telephone and virtual interviews. I will discuss group interviews, also known as panel interviews. I'll go over the STAR technique, which is a useful way to answer behavioral or situational questions. I'll talk about informational interviewing, and finally, as I said, I'll address questions. So first on today's agenda are telephone interviews. The purpose of phone interviews is typically the intent is an initial assessment for an employer to decide if a candidate should be invited for an in-person interview. By the time a company or organization is conducting a phone interview with a candidate, they've already vetted the resume closely along with the description of the job, and they've decided that pretty much based on what the what the resume and the cover letter show, that that particular candidate does meet the basic requirements for that position. And the phone interview is sort of the first step in identifying if that candidate would be an appropriate fit for the position for other reasons that may not necessarily come through in a resume or cover letter. A telephone interview is likely going to be with a recruiter or HR professional from the organization. They will many times be the first person who reviews a resume that has been sent for a position, and they will do the initial screen on behalf of a hiring manager. So like I said, many times it's a recruiter or a human resources representative, but not always. Many times, particularly in a smaller organization, the actual hiring manager will conduct a phone interview as a first step to try and save themselves some time, as well as the time of a particular candidate. Many times phone interviews involve very basic general questions, questions about strengths and weaknesses, questions about your basic job history, your education, things like that, very basic general questions. They also are likely to include some housekeeping types of questions to just get a feel for if you, in general, would be well suited enough to bring in and take the time and effort to interview you in person. The thing that's important to keep in mind with a phone screen is that this is truly the first impression that an employer has of you as a candidate. So it's very important to take phone interviews just as seriously as you would an in-person interview. So that being said, it's crucial to prepare in advance. When an employer contacts you and schedules a telephone screen, make sure that the communication you have with that person, whether it be via email or phone, that you conduct yourself professionally throughout. Do the best you can to prepare for the phone interview in advance. When you're scheduling the phone interview, make sure that it's clear whether you will be calling the employer or they will be calling you. If they will be calling you, you perhaps need to give yourself even more time in advance to make sure that the place where you will speak with them on the phone is quiet, there are no distractions. Make sure that if you're using a mobile device, which many of you use solely a mobile phone, that the battery is charged, that you have good service, that you have all bars, quote unquote, on your phone. And it's not recommended to use a speakerphone when you are doing a phone interview. It can be more difficult for the person to hear you. It can also allow for more distractions and background noise to come into the conversation. So it's recommended that you do not use a speakerphone. Make sure that as you're preparing in advance, you have a copy of the resume that was sent for that particular position, maybe the cover letter that you put together for that position, and you will have prepared for the phone interview just as you would for a face-to-face interview, so you'll know what's on the resume and cover letter in advance. You'll have obviously the job description and the company information in front of you. to refer to during the interview, maybe a notepad to take some notes on the questions that you're asked, other things that come up during the conversation that you may want to address afterwards, and also have some water available in case you get tongue-tied or you get a dry mouth from speaking a lot. That's something also to have on hand as well. Take advantage of the fact that it's a phone interview so that you can have things like the job description in front of you along with your resume and the notepad. I did want to note that in some cases, a phone screen may be unexpected. You may get a phone call from a potential employer, and they, instead of saying, I would like to schedule a phone screen, they will say something like, do you have a few minutes to speak with me? And the conversation could actually turn into an actual interview. So if this should happen and you are actively job seeking, my recommendation for you is to keep your resume near the phone or easily accessible at all times. If a call comes in from a number that you don't recognize, again, many people use mobile phones, I would recommend that if you're not prepared for a conversation with a recruiter, that you let the call go to voicemail, listen to the voicemail, and then call back as soon as possible when you are in a better setting. The other thing may be that you are currently working and you're conducting a job search confidentially. And if that occurs, you certainly want to let the call go to voicemail and then contact the person back when you're able to go to a private area where there's no distractions. You don't risk getting yourself into hot water in your current position. The other thing to keep in mind with unexpected phone interviews is that many times an employer is doing so because they want to see how you conduct yourself in more of a stressful situation. So that's why it's important to make sure that if you are actively job searching and you see those phone calls come through, that you're prepared at any point in time for the person on the other end to be reaching out to you in reference to your job search. A couple other pointers when it comes to the act of interviewing over the phone. One of the most important things, and it seems a little silly at first, is to smile and dress for the part. Believe it or not, an employer can tell over the phone if you are smiling, if you have confidence, if you have energy and enthusiasm in your voice, if you are dressed, many times dressed professionally, it can make you feel more confident, and that will come across in the phone in your voice. It's also suggested that you remove earrings when you're speaking on the phone, just because sometimes they can tap on the receiver and it causes a bit of a distraction and background noise for the person you're speaking with. You should never chew gum or eat while on a phone interview. Again, these seem to be obvious, but as I think of my days as a recruiter myself, it was surprising how many people wouldn't think about these types of things when they're having conversations related to job search. Again, when you're smiling, people can tell in your voice, and it makes a big difference. Another suggestion for phone interviews is that anytime you are speaking with someone about your job search on the phone, one of the first things that you should do is ask for a clarification of their name, their phone number, as well as their email address. And this is perhaps initially, in case the call drops, you're able to call the person back. And it also is helpful for follow-up, because toward the end of a phone interview, you may not necessarily think about asking for the person's name, and it may not be comfortable to ask them to repeat what their name is. And if you do so at the beginning, it's an easy way to make sure you've got the information and you're able to follow up easily. Another pointer is to, throughout the conversation, listen very carefully and be cautious to not interrupt the person. It can be more difficult in the phone situation to make sure that you don't interrupt the interviewer, because you may be excited to respond to their question, but use some patience and exercise some discretion when you're speaking on the phone with a person to make sure that you get all of the question before you respond. The other advantage to a phone interview is that you're able to take notes on the questions. So if it makes sense to sort of jot down a couple of things while the person is asking the question. That can be a good way to make sure that you stay on topic. And finally, toward the end of the phone interview, if the interviewer does say to you, do you have any questions for me? Make sure that just as you've prepared for other interviews in person, that you have some questions in mind that you could ask that person toward the end. And you can also ask what their next steps are. You can ask the timing for the hiring of the position. You can ask what their next steps will be, if they'll hear from you in phone, if you should respond to them and follow up, and so forth. The other thing to do is certainly, just as you would with any in-person interview, is plan to follow up with that person once the interview has ended. Here are just a couple of examples of the types of questions that you might be asked on a phone interview. Some of these are the same types of questions that you might hear in any sort of in-person interview, but some of them may be a little bit different. So I recommend that these are the types of things that you should consider. Like I said, phone interviews tend to be more basic, general types of housekeeping questions, but not always. These are some of the ones that we think are most popular. Obviously, tell me about yourself is a big one that pretty much will come up in any sort of interview conversation, even if it's an in-person interview after you've already spoken with the person on the phone, but maybe not. So that's definitely something to be prepared for with your pitch. What do you know about this organization? That's also another question that comes up frequently on phone screens, because when you're applying for positions, it says a lot to an employer if you've taken the time to do a little bit of research on the organization and putting together your cover letter specific to that organization and that job, and it shows them that you've already done your homework even at the point of applying for the job. It shows that particular employer that you're serious about your job search and you've already taken some time to do some initial research on that organization. What are your strengths and weaknesses? This is very similar to the tell me about yourself question, that an employer is just trying to get to know you a little bit more, a little bit further than what it says on your resume and cover letter. And another reason why I recommend having your resume and cover letter available to you during the phone interview is that the types of things that you highlighted in your resume and in your cover letter were obviously appealing to this employer when they screened your resume and cover letter. So those are the types of strengths and weaknesses that you should focus on in your interview. The other questions that they may ask in a phone interview are more housekeeping type questions. When can you start a position? Why are you looking for a new position? And these are just simple questions that they need to know the answers to really decide if you're the appropriate fit for this position and if they should invite you for an in-person interview. The other one is, what is your salary requirement? Because many times an organization, they have very specific dollars in mind, and if the two of you are not even close, not even in the ballpark when it comes to the salary, it's better for the employer to have that conversation initially so that they're not wasting their time or yours. So that's just a couple examples of the types of phone questions that may come to you. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about virtual interviews, interviews that are not necessarily phone interviews, but not necessarily face-to-face interviews. This is something that's becoming more and more commonplace, and it's something that takes a little bit more preparation, perhaps, than a traditional phone interview, and it's a little bit different in how it's conducted. This is something that might be used in place of a traditional phone interview, or it may be used in place of a traditional face-to-face interview. The workforce is, more and more people are working remotely. More and more people are working on teams where they may have team members that sit, in different locations around the country or around the world even. So it only makes sense that job interviews are starting to take place a lot more frequently virtually. In your preparations and in taking part in a virtual interview, my suggestion would be to consider it more closely related to a face-to-face setting than a phone setting. But you still need to follow the same rules and tips for preparing as you would for both. A couple of other recommendations when it comes to virtual interviews is make sure that you find out in advance what platform will be used. So if that particular employer has a specific program that they use for all virtual interviews, they likely will have sent you the information in advance. Make sure that you take time to make sure that your computer or your mobile device or tablet works, is compatible with that particular program, and that you know exactly the steps that you need to take when it's time for that particular interview. If you're going to be using Skype, make sure that you have good service. Make sure that you have the correct screen name for the interview and all of those things, and do these well in advance of the interview so that you won't be flustered when it comes time to actually do the interview. The other things to keep in mind, certainly if you're doing a virtual interview, you want to make sure that your phone is turned off. Even if you put your phone on vibrate mode, that still can be distracting. And make sure that other distractions have been removed. Pay close attention to what the interviewer would see behind you. I remember I've done some Skype career advising counseling, and I've noticed that there'll be lots of distractions in the background. Pets, for one. More than one time, a person I've been speaking with via Skype has had pets in the background that have made noise and you know, have caused a distraction during the interview. And it also is a good idea to make sure that there's not a messy environment. If you're sitting and your kitchen is in the background and there's a sink full of dirty dishes, those kinds of things can give a certain, make a certain impression with the interviewer. So keep that in mind when you're doing a virtual interview as well. The same thing is important to keep in mind if you are using your phone for a virtual interview. Make sure that you have good service, make sure that you're free of distractions, and so forth. Virtual interviews can be sort of a different beast in terms of challenging. As I mentioned, they're more closely related to face-to-face, but you have to prepare similar to how you would for a face-to-face as well as a phone interview. So the next topic for discussion today is group interviewing or panel interviewing. There are some different purposes that an organization may conduct an interview in a group setting. And what I'll focus most of my remarks on today are when you are interviewing with multiple representatives from the same employer. So the purpose for those types of interviews is, you know, there are a couple reasons. One is to save time, simply to you know, give you an opportunity to meet with a number of individuals at an organization. And also it allows those individuals at the organizations to clear a specific time in their schedules so they're not constantly having to schedule and meet with lots of candidates. It also gives you an opportunity to see sort of gives you a nice close look at the culture of the organization, particularly if you're sitting in a group in a room meeting with a group of people. It's interesting to see how they interact with one another. That gives you an idea of what the sort of culture is at that organization. Group interviews also give interviewers an opportunity to see you and get the same sample of your behavior. And they get to always see at the same time how you handle a stress environment. So those are just some of the purposes that an organization may do a group setting for your interview. Some of the types of things that you should do in preparation for a group interview: make sure that you bring multiple copies of your resume. Even though they already have a copy of your resume, it never fails. A person may not be prepared. And it always shows a lot of forethought on your part if you bring along multiple copies of your resume, so that if they're not sure where your resume is or they have any trouble finding it, you can provide them a copy. My recommendation is at the very beginning of the interview, again, so that you don't forget at the end, is to ask for business cards. And when you first walk into the room, shake hands with each person that is there. You certainly will have trouble remembering everyone's names, but at least if you make eye contact with each member of the committee and shake hands with them, that at least sets the tone that you are giving each person in the room your undivided attention and you're happy to be there to meet them. It can be a little bit challenging in a group interview setting to know exactly who to sort of follow in terms of setting the tone in the interview. And the best advice that we give in that setting is that when you're in doubt, take cues from the leader. If there was a particular person who you spoke to on the phone in scheduling the interview, or a particular person who introduced themselves to you first, or maybe introduced the other members of the room, take cues from that person and follow their lead. As far as answering questions, eye contact can be a tricky thing during a group interview setting, but our recommendation again is to make eye contact with, if each person in the room is asking a different question, when they ask a question, after they've finished, you look and make eye contact with them, then provide your response. And then once you've finished, make eye contact again with the person who asked you the question. That's a good cue for them to know that you're finished speaking, you're finished responding to the question, and that then gives them the sign that they're able to move to the next. Another type of group interview setting that may occur is that you might meet multiple people at the same organization at the same time, but individually. So typically what may happen is you arrive for the interview and you may or may not have been told that you would be meeting with multiple representatives from the organization. The first person may introduce themselves to you and you'll meet with them, and then they'll say, okay, now that we've finished speaking, I'm going to introduce you to my colleague, and they will take you to that person to meet with them. And then that person will introduce you to someone else. So that may happen in an interview setting. Another thing that may happen is there might be one person that is sort of your escort that brings you to meet with different individuals at that same organization. That could occur. You might meet individually with some people and then meet with everyone at one time in the setting. It's, you know, always your hope is that you'll be prepared in advance to know exactly how the interview will be set up. But it also, you know, these types of things can change, particularly if in an organization, if they realize that they want more people than just one or two to meet with a particular candidate, they may try and, you know, bring you in to meet with more people while you're there to save themselves some time and effort, and also to save you some time and effort, particularly if you're working currently and the prospective employer is aware of this. They may want to try and make it easier for you to meet with everybody in their organization on the same day rather than having to go back multiple times. In terms of following up after you've attended a group interview, it's crucial to follow up with at least the person who was the lead, who was your primary contact in scheduling the interview and during the interview itself. But if at all possible, it's a great idea to try and follow up with each person you met individually. And the recommendation is to send brief emails to each of the interviewers citing something specific that you spoke with that particular person about, while also keeping in mind that they will likely share these emails with one another. So that's why it's a good idea to try and make them specific and targeted to each interviewer if possible. If you're not able to follow up with each and every interview you met with, at least send a message to one of the people and requesting that they share your appreciation with their colleagues that you met. It's likely that they will do so either way, but that's sort of a good way to get around it if you're not able to follow up with each and every person you met. I will take one quick second to note, if you interview with multiple candidates, If so, this would be a setting where you go in for an interview for a position and there are multiple candidates interviewing at the same time for a position. This kind of thing may happen. I've experienced this happening when an organization is hiring for seasonal positions. Maybe in the retail setting, they may have an opportunity for 25 or 30 customer service reps during the holiday season. And in that case, they may have multiple candidates come and interview at the same time. They may have multiple interviewers speaking with each candidate individually, or they may simply have candidates come in to see how they do in a team setting. So it's important to keep in mind that that type of thing can occur as well. It can be a very stressful situation, but at the same time, keep in mind that each and every candidate interviewing for the position is in the same situation that you are. Keep in mind that I'll be addressing your questions at the end of today's webinar, so please send them in at any point. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears slightly and talk a little bit about what is called the STAR technique. And this is a technique that is useful for answering questions that are of a behavioral or situational setting. So when you're using the STAR technique, it's recommended to use, again, with those specific types of questions where the employer will ask you to describe a time when you, or tell me about a time when you, and the idea is that the employer wants to find out what your behavior has been like in situations in the past in order to predict how you would react to similar situations in the future. So when you're answering those kinds of questions, we recommend that you use the STAR technique so that you're able to provide a complete response, not lose track of your thought, and again, follow along to really answer the question to the best that you can. So we call it STAR because it stands for situation, task, action, result. So for example, if you're interviewing for a customer relations position and you're trying to answer the question, tell me about a time when you solved a problem for a customer. And this is a classic example of a behavioral or situational question. So your response using the STAR technique would be to first describe the situation, then explain the task at hand, then describe the action that you took, and finally what resulted. So in answering that question, tell me about a time when you solved a problem for a customer. The situation in your response could be, I was a customer service rep for a photography company and I was responsible for speaking to customers who received orders that were incomplete. The task was that you would find out why the error occurred and correct it, and in doing so you would make the client happy and hopefully maintain that relationship for the future. The action that you took would be, first, I look in our order history and compare it to what the customer was missing. Then I would make changes or additions in our system and rush the remaining item in their shipment, and I would share those details with our quality control department. I also came up with the idea that it would help with retaining those clients if I would offer a discount on a future order. And the result of that was that the order was corrected, the customer was happy, and they were more likely to return for repeat business. So again, if you go back, the question was, tell me about a time when you solved a problem for a customer. And you used the STAR technique to answer this question completely. Situation, task, action, result. You describe the situation, the task that you had in that role, the action that you took, and then you end with the result. So this is pretty much a way that you can answer any and all questions that relate to a behavior or a situation. Okay, finally we'll shift back into an unusual or different type of interview. And this one is completely different than your typical job interview. And this I'm referring to as informational interviews. The purpose of an informational interview is to gather information and advice about a field, about a job, or even an organization. The other purpose of an informational interview is simply to build a professional network. As I said, it's not the same thing as a job interview in any way. It's important to keep in mind that an informational interview is called an interview, and I would say it's more like an interview if you're a journalist as opposed to an interview if you're a job seeker. The idea is that you are doing an informational interview with someone to ask for ideas, to get their impressions, to get advice, but not to ask for jobs or referrals for jobs. Again, an informational interview is not to ask for jobs and not to ask for referrals for jobs. Just like with any other interview, however, the follow-up is crucial for informationals. As I said before, another reason that one might conduct informational interviews is because they're very useful for networking. And an informational interview can really be a natural first step in building relationships. The idea is that you speak with a person as part of an informational interview to get ideas and advice and build a relationship with them. And eventually, you want them to think of you the next time they hear about a job opening that might be appropriate. It can be a really good alternative, and I wanted to mention this because I know that many students at the School of Professional Studies are not able to fit internships into their schedules. But informational interviewing can be a good way for you to get the benefits of networking that you might get by doing an internship, but it's something that you can fit more readily into your busy schedule. Informational interviews can also be the very beginning of a mentor and mentee relationship. People love to talk about themselves. So most people, if they're approached for an informational interview, are doing so because they enjoy it. And many times for that reason, it can be the first step in developing a relationship with a person as a mentor. So if you're thinking of conducting informational interviews, first of all, I would suggest that you speak with a career advisor to get some more pointers on how you would go about conducting these. But a couple simple steps and things to keep in mind is that if you want to start doing some informational interviews, it's very important to choose the right people to target and how you will target them. Many times if you speak with your career advisor or another trusted advisor, they will be able to give you some ideas about who you might speak to and how you might approach them. Does it make sense to send an email? Does it make sense for a person that is a mutual connection to introduce you via email or via phone or in person? Does it make sense to reach out to someone via LinkedIn? There are lots of different approaches that you might take in targeting someone and asking them for an informational interview, but it's important to keep in mind that this is something you are asking them for advice. So again, as I said, people enjoy talking about themselves, but you have to figure out the right way to approach them and the right people to approach. If you are able to schedule an informational interview with someone, it's important to keep in mind that even though this is not a job interview, you still need to prepare, do your research, and perhaps most importantly, know yourself. And when I say prepare, you want to do some of the same things you would do for a job interview. Research the person you'll be interviewing. Research the organization to which they belong. Do some preparation in advance and find out a little bit about the industry. Who are the competitors for that particular person's company? And know yourself. Understand what are the things you have listed on your resume. What are your career goals? What are your objectives? What are the types of things that you really truly want to know from that person about their career, their industry, and their organization? In that same vein, develop a list of questions in advance that you will ask that person. You want to make this informational interview as easy as possible on the person you're speaking with. Remember, they're volunteering their time for you. So you want to keep in mind that if you go in with a specific list of questions, it'll take away from any sort of uneasy feeling that that person might have in not knowing you and being able to talk about their career and themselves with you. Another part of making it easy on them is to find out from them what is the best time. If they're really busy for the next month, agree to follow up in a month and see if that's a better time. If they're willing to meet you for coffee, if they would like for you to come to their office, if they would like to come to you, something like that, ask them what would be easiest for them and then set it up from there. Another thing going into informational interviews is to just ask for and expect 15 to 20 minutes. And most likely, once you start talking with that person, they'll want to speak with you longer, particularly if you've taken the time to do your research, you have a lot of interesting questions to ask them. They'll be more than willing to spend a little bit more than 15 or 20 minutes with you. But at the same time, it makes sense to just ask for a small amount of time so that they don't feel overwhelmed, and it makes it seem easy for them to be able to participate. And I thought I would come up with just a list of some sample questions that you might ask in an informational interview setting. And this is, certainly not the extent of the kind of things that you want to ask, but this gives a general idea of what the types of things are to talk about in an informational interview. I'll touch on just a couple of these and why I think they're good ones and important ones to ask. What do you like most about your job? This is a question that I think is a good one to sort of start with because it's not too technical. It doesn't require the person to do a lot of sort of forethought and putting together a response that's going to give you a lot of detail. And it also gives them an opportunity to sort of talk about themselves in a way that's comfortable for them. So that's something that I recommend starting with in an informational interview, just to sort of get them talking and give you an idea of sort of what the pace of the interview may be like from there on out. These other questions are pretty good. I also mentioned, would you mind critiquing my resume? And this is something that may or may not have occurred prior to the informational interview. When you're asking a person to do an informational interview with you, they may request your resume in advance of the interview. They may not. If they ask for your resume in advance, certainly send it to them, and maybe you could say to them, you've had a chance to review my resume, I hope. What did you think? Or if they did not request your resume, you could say to them during the informational interview, after we've finished speaking today, would you mind critiquing my resume? That way it puts the ball in their court and they don't feel as much pressure to look at the document in front of you. Another really, really good question that I think can be useful, but you have to be careful because it can be a little bit too pushy, is who else would you suggest I speak with about my job search? It's very important that this question is framed appropriately so the person doesn't feel like you're asking them to refer you for a job. Because at the beginning of my conversation, as I said, an informational interview is not asking for a job and not asking for referrals for jobs. So if you simply are able to frame it that you're interested in speaking with more people because the conversation that you're having with this particular person has been so useful, then that's probably the appropriate way to ask that question. As I said, these are just some examples of the types of informational interview questions that get the person talking and really give you some valuable information for your job search and moving forward. And I thought that I would sort of wrap up today's webinar and talk a little bit about following up in general. And as I say in the first bullet on here, following up after each and every interview is absolutely crucial. As I mentioned earlier, when I worked as a recruiter, this was something that not nearly enough candidates did. And many times when a candidate did follow up, it sort of moved them up in terms of being a better qualified candidate. I can't say it enough. It is extremely crucial to follow up after every single interview. It's your opportunity to obviously express your appreciation and thank the person for taking time to meet with you. It's a great way to reiterate the interest that you have in the position and the company. It helps you stay top of mind, particularly if that employer is interviewing several candidates, or if you're toward the final stage of an interview for a position. It helps you sort of stay top of mind when that person is busy with their work and also meeting lots of other people. And finally, following up can be a way to address concerns that may have come up in the interview. Perhaps you didn't feel that you answered a question very well, or maybe they asked a technical question and you got tripped up in your answer. You can sometimes address those types of concerns in your follow-up and say something like, in our conversation about my computer skills, I neglected to mention that I've used QuickBooks previously. I remember that after I walked out of the interview, and I felt it would be important to remind you. The other thing with following up is we get lots of questions about how can you follow up and is email appropriate. My recommendation is that email works just fine. It works much quickly, obviously, than snail mail. And again, if an employer is interviewing multiple candidates, it's important to keep in mind that you want something that's going to get to them right away. If you want to also follow up with a handwritten thank you card or a letter in the mail, I think that that can be a nice touch to sort of set you apart from other applicants. But I think most crucial is following up in some way, and in that respect, email works just fine. Another note about following up, because informational interviews are sort of a different ballgame, I also recommend making sure that you connect on LinkedIn after every informational interview, in addition to sending that person a follow-up thank you. Thank you notes, again, are crucial. They can really make or break your chances. In the same respect that following up and sending a thank you note is extremely important, make sure that you proofread, because there's nothing worse than having a really, really good, strong interview and then sending a thank you note with a typo. So just keep that in mind as you're communicating at all stages of the interview process, particularly with follow-up. And then finally, in terms of following up, even if you don't want the position, it's still very important to send some sort of note of appreciation. You never know how things can change in the future, or perhaps this person has information about another job that would be a better fit for you, or if there should be another opportunity in the future. You just never know, and it's a great idea to sort of follow up and maintain sort of a positive relationship, even if you don't think you would take the position. So that concludes the presentation portion of today's webinar. So I'll go ahead and move into answering some of the questions that have come through today. Thank you for sending those in. Feel free to send in a few more. It looks like we've got a little more than 10 minutes left in our time today. Okay, just bear with me a second, folks. I'm reading through some of these questions. Okay, this is a great question. How do you handle a telephone interview if the connection is terrible and you can hardly hear the interviewer? In this case, this is where I believe I mentioned that at the very beginning of a call, you want to make sure you get the person's name, email, and phone number. And if it's really, really a terrible connection, I would suggest, instead of going back and forth and asking, can you hear me? Yes, no, that it's better to hang up the call and send either an email or call them back and see if the connection is better. The reason I mentioned sending an email is that if you continue to have a bad connection, it can just sort of create sort of an uncomfortable tone for the remaining part of the interview. So that's why I say that sometimes email can work to your favor, and you can communicate via email to figure out a better time for the two of you to speak when you would have a better connection. Okay. I do see two questions about informational interviews, so I'll go ahead I'll go ahead and address both of these since they both relate to the same topic. The first is, as you're doing your research prior to an informational interview, you discover that they have a job opening that you would like to apply for. Is it okay to ask about the opening and if they would be willing to help you? This is a tough one, and I think that my recommendation would be to not necessarily bring up that specific position during the informational interview. Sort of see how it goes, see how the relationship works, see what kind of a rapport there is with that person. As long as you've done your homework and you've prepared some really interesting questions and you're having a good conversation with the person, it's likely that they will say, if you see any opportunities in my organization that you're interested in, I would be happy to help you. At that point, you can bring it up. If they don't say that, but they, the informational interview seems to go well when you're following up, this is a great thing to bring up in your follow-up. You could say, after our conversation and learning so many great things about your organization, it just further solidified that I'm interested in working in your organization, and I noticed there was a job open. Is there anything you could advise me specifically about this position? And instead of asking the person to send your resume or help you get the job, ask if they have specific advice about applying for that job. And at that point, they're likely to say, well, let me just help you. It's important to keep in mind that they want to be able to help you, but you don't want to be too aggressive or pushy in the informational interview setting. The other question is it okay to send the resume in advance of meeting with the person if you're going to be doing an informational interview? I mean, I think in many cases it is probably fine. What I might suggest is that if you are reaching out to the person and asking them if they would be willing to do an informational interview, when you're arranging it and scheduling it, ask them if they would like to see your resume. And if they say yes, certainly send it. But I think it's better to do that than just initially send the resume, again, because it can be seen as a little bit too aggressive, and you want to make sure that they're sort of leading the way in the informational interview, even though you're the one who's requested it. Okay, and here's another question that's sort of related to informational interviews, so I'll try to address this as well. This pertains to LinkedIn. It says, should you connect with anyone you interview with on LinkedIn following the interview or only after informationals? And I think, again, this depends very much on the situation. If you develop a really strong rapport with the person you're meeting in the job interview and it feels like it might be useful to connect with them on LinkedIn, you can do so, but not until after the interview process is over. So in this case, if you are on a first interview and then a second interview, and during this time you've been looking at the person's LinkedIn profile and your research, that's fine. But I would not suggest connecting with them on LinkedIn until after the interview process is over completely. And then in that case, if you don't get the position but you felt you had a good rapport with the person, you could certainly reach out and connect with them on LinkedIn. I would suggest sending a little note and saying it was nice meeting you during the process, even though it didn't work out for me. I enjoyed connecting with you. You also could, if you are hired for the position, obviously it makes a lot of sense to connect with your new colleagues. So that makes sense after the fact. But again, as I said, it doesn't make sense to do it until the whole interview process is completely over. Okay, here's a good question about following up. And I think that there's a fine line between following up and being too pushy and aggressive and annoying and doing just enough. And the question is, if you have a telephone interview, then a first and maybe second interview, is it too much to follow up after each one? No, it's not too much to follow up after each one, particularly if you are meeting with different people each time. It's important, again, to show that you're serious about your job search and you're definitely interested in working in that organization, that you give the same respect to each and every person you meet. So that means if you speak with a recruiter on the phone screen, send a follow-up to them following that. If you speak with a hiring manager and an employee in that particular department on the first interview, follow up with those people. If you go back on a third and final interview and you meet with a VP for that department, make sure that you follow up with that person. Again, it's all about respect and making sure that each and every person you meet with has the same level of respect from you, and you take the time to really show them your true appreciation for the position. Looks like we've got about 5 more minutes, so if there are other questions, please feel free to send those. If I don't address your question today, I would encourage you to either reach out to us here in Career Services at SPS, or if you would like to, if you're with another CUNY campus, reach out to the Career Services office in your own campus. I would certainly encourage you to do so. Okay, here's one question about group interviews, and I'll go ahead and address this one. And I think that as if phone interviews and in-person interviews aren't scary enough, group interviews are a whole different ballgame. And this question is about how do you maintain composure and make sure that you're having a balanced conversation without getting too nervous in a group interview setting. And I think it's really hard. I think group interviews are probably one of the most stressful interview situations that you can get. As I had said, follow the lead of the person who you've spoken with most readily during the scheduling process and during the actual interview itself. I also think that particularly in a group interview setting, it's okay to say, okay, give me a minute to think about this. I want to make sure that I'm answering your question appropriately. And that sort of gives yourself a little bit of time to think, breathe, relax before you give a response. The other thing that can sort of help you maintain your composure is that, as I had suggested, if a person asks you a question, when they're finished asking the question, look them in the eye, then give your response, then look them in the eye again so that you're letting them know that you're finished with your question. And that's a good way to sort of help you understand if you stayed on topic and help them understand that they're able to ask you the next question. Okay. Here's another question about follow-up. How long should a follow-up email be? This one really depends on the circumstances. This is definitely one where I would say speak with an advisor to find out the best way to follow up. But I think that if you sort of align the length and detail of your follow-up with the length and detail of your interview, that's sort of a good rule of thumb to follow. So if you're talking about a 15-minute phone interview with a recruiter, then you might send a more brief email sort of thanking that person for their time and thanking them for reaching out to you for the position and expressing your interest in the organization and your hope that they will contact you to schedule another interview. And then if you go for a first interview and you meet the hiring manager and everyone else on the team, and it seems like that's going to be the end of the interview process, you probably want to do a longer, more detailed follow-up addressing things that you talked about with the hiring manager as well as things you talked about with each of the team members. So again, if the interview is a little bit more in-depth with more people, it's a longer, even a more technical type conversation, then you want to probably be more in-depth and long and technical in your cover letter. I'm sorry, in your thank you letter. So, it's just a general rule of thumb to tailor your follow-up to what the interview itself was like. I've gotten a couple questions about salary range, and that's sort of a big, complicated answer, and I don't think I'm going to touch on that today. I'm realizing we're out of time. I would suggest that if that was a question you had posed today, that you might consider signing up for our third and final webinar, because we're going to touch on salary negotiations. So I'll go ahead and give a shameless plug for the third interview that we're having, but I would suggest that you consider attending that, or also you could speak with your career advisor or reach out to us here at SPS and Career Services to go over the salary negotiation questions. I've enjoyed speaking with all of you today. I hope that the webinar was worthwhile, and I hope that you've learned a lot about phone interviews, using the STAR technique, informational interviews, and group interviews. And I hope that we have you attend another webinar from CUNY SPS in the future.